Aha, okay. So let's see. If I'm not mistaken, I need to share the screen, and I've learned how to do that. Oh yeah, here.
I'm getting you there we go.
So now you should all see the screen. Oh, 1 second. One moment, just getting ready. Oh, I have to open presentation mode. 1 second. So Scott, if you want to talk something about EWRA in the meantime, feel free to do that.
Well, you know, I appreciate that opportunity because I really did miss the chance to plug our social media accounts earlier. So we're a good team here. I like this. IWRA does have a lot of social media, and we'd be really happy if everyone in the audience would have the opportunity to go give it a look. You know, we have a LinkedIn webpage, which really allows us to kind of continue the conversation we start here. But we also have a Twitter, which is very popular with everyone these days. So, you know, give us a follow there. And I'm sure that many people on the panel also promote themselves through various social media, a good way to follow their publications and everything and engage in debates with them. So feel free to look up our panelists as well as ourselves and give us a follow. We appreciate that. How does this look now? It looks ready to me.
Yes, it does.
Yes,
so, Peter,
awesome.
Well, I will present here, or I will give an introduction to the paper, The Effects of Tailor-Made Flood Risk Advice for Homeowners in Flanders, Belgium, which is a paper by me, Luc Boelens and Barbara Tempels. And, well, let's give it a try. So, there is a deadlock between government and residents. There are pluvial and fluvial floods happening in Flanders, like we know that from other occasions elsewhere in Europe and the world. And homeowners should be able to adapt their house as well. Governments are doing their actions, but homeowners can add up to that as well. That's the idea. But there is this gap. Government actors are more reasoning from a cost-benefit perspective and say, well, we can do dikes, but also citizens can do something. Residential actors are more reasoning from a fairness perspective and say, yeah, but it's not fair that you're harming us with extra costs because we cannot help that we have these floods. And what I'm researching in this paper is tailored advice promoting these homeowners to get convinced to take some actions at their houses. So that's already this slide actually. So we will look at, on the one hand, on the evaluation on the tailored advice given by the Flanders Environmental Agency, and we'll go into depth about the project later on. And on the other hand, is it also influencing flood risk management in general? So not only the citizens, but also the system of flood risk management in Flanders. So we've looked at 3 case study areas in Flanders. The village of Gerardsbergen, Lebbeke, and Sint-Pietersleeuw. And the Flanders Environmental Agency selected these areas to give flood risk advice as they have been recently experienced extensive floods in 2010, 2016, 2017, and a lot of citizens' houses were harmed. And as such, they got a certain advice. So we have the Flanders Environmental Agency, who selected 210 participants in 3 municipalities. All these people did have flood risk experience in the municipality, but also these specific houses. In some cases, they had water at the doorstep. In some cases, there have been floods already for 27 times in the past 25 years. So very diverse, but they all had flood risk experience. And the advice itself is about sending an expert to the house on the invitation of these homeowners to look at the situation of the house. What can you in your house adapt? In some cases, it's about blocking the doorsteps in case of a flood comes. It could be specific paint for the walls. It could be a back valve in the sewer system. That kind of solutions were suggested in these projects. And what I did personally was I did 13 interviews with homeowners and the project leader of the project to see, okay, you're now getting this advice, but what will you do with it? Moreover, I did a survey afterwards when they received the advice among all participants, and I got returned 26 evaluation forms, and we will discuss it over here. So, as I said, some solutions that you can have: the backup valve, walls around the house, and we see here a picture of a man who adapted his full house, got there in the local news, and is really proud of what he did. He was an example for the neighborhood, and as such also for new projects that are coming up now in by the Flanders Environmental Agency. So what is this advice doing? It is suggesting or explaining how much risk there is for a homeowner, how often can a flood happen, what can it damage your property, but it also gives information on how to what kind of solutions you can have so you can reduce the risk. Besides, well, we by doing so, the homeowners are how you say that, suggested to do some adaptations, and for many of them, this is a first encounter with the government or representative of them that listens to their story. And finally, there are a lot of people having questions on how to solve it. Who should I contact? And they provide some access to a network of people that can help out with the problems. So we have an expert that listens to the story, gives an advice. It's free of charge in this test cases. There is well, they give advice on solutions. Also do some trust building between government and citizens, because the situations is in many cases quite tense, and that results then in a tailored advice specifically for that house and specifically for that homeowner. So they also look at the financial situation, the possibilities that are in the house technically, etc., etc. Homeowners generally experience it as quite positive. It is their first encounter. I'm repeating myself here a bit, but anyway, they feel empowered because there's finally someone telling some independent advice. A lot of people have been calling around people, certain institutions or experts, but got conflicting input. And now there is someone that they feel comfortable with, and they give some proper information, and that makes them willing to invest. So I did these interviews, and what you see is that there is a wide diversity of responses. I will not get through them here in detail, but generally you see people that say, okay, I know I'm at risk, but I have no clue what to do. What kind of expert do I need? Or I'm willing to do it, but it costs me money. Can I get subsidies? We have people that are highly aware and have resources, but are lacking this neutral advice. And they are very happy with someone that's coming in now to tell us. Others did already change everything in the house, have a safe house, but they want to have some confirmation. So they're more looking at, is it right what I'm doing here, or do I need to do it differently? And then also you have people that are not so aware and are blaming the governments for the problems that they have. No one informed them, and for them this is also a first encounter to say, hey, how do we solve this? It is your turn, government, please. What are you going to do? So it's the tailored advice becomes a sort of interaction moment between the citizens and the government. Some short conclusions. 11% was at the moment of receiving the advice willing to adapt their house. That is amazing, but I think we can do better. And that is maybe because it was in many ways still sort of what I call an information machine, providing a lot of information, but not really giving opportunities to, with this advice, to go to your insurance company or to your local government and say, hey, this is a situation, I can do this, but you can do that. So it could be more a negotiation tool as well. And moreover, we've only been contacting the people that are already knowing that they have a certain flood risk because they have this flood experience. So the gap remains. What can we do instead? We should approach flood risk management and using this tailored advice more from a relational perspective. That means that we should not only look at the government and the citizens or the residents, but also look at other actors, for example, insurers, brokers, construction companies. They could be involved in the organization of this system. So providing discounts on products, getting discount on your insurance when you have adapted your house, that kind of things. And besides, it's also depending on certain informal agreements that could be changed as well. That is my last slide, I guess. Yes. So that was my show. I think we go to the next one.
Yes. Scott, do we proceed with the next presentation and take questions afterwards? Is that
yes?
Is that
as a reminder, folks, go ahead and send your questions. There's a question box in the GoToWebinar control panel about halfway down. Go ahead and type the questions in, and I'll see them, and then we'll ask them to the panel at the end of the presentations. So, thank you.
Okay, so next up in our panel is Karin Snell, and Karin will. Let me see if I can turn the camera a bit now. Oh, yes, I can. And Karin will talk about her contribution to this special issue, but also to the FloodLabel project. So, Karin, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Thomas. Yes, I'm presenting the paper that I wrote with Patrick Witte, Thomas Hartman, and Stan Veertman. And it's called More Than a One-Size-Fits-All Approach, Tailoring Flood Risk Communication to Plural Residents' Perspectives. I started this article with a literature review on actually how flood risk communication is currently done. And I came to the conclusion that it still very much develops from an expert point of view. And therefore, it doesn't necessarily match the lay perceptions of floods and flood risk in general. And on the next slide, I would like to show you.
Oh, wait a second. Yeah.
Okay. An example of how an expert point of view is taken for granted in flood risk communication, and how that might not match lay knowledge perceptions. Because this map shows the main flood barriers in the Netherlands and also the chance per year that they might flood. And as you can see, the chances go up to 1 in 10,000. These numbers and these probabilities are very often used in flood risk communication. And yeah, I think it's very obvious that it doesn't necessarily match a daily life risk perception of a resident in the Netherlands. So what I try to do in this article is kind of to research how to change this around. So how can we get kind of like a broader consideration of residents' preferences in flood risk communication instead of this solely expert knowledge perspective. And I did empirical research based on interviews for that in the Netherlands. I have done interviews with residents of flood risk areas, living in flood-prone areas, which led to 51 structured interviews and 18 in-depth interviews. And specifically, these in-depth interviews I want to discuss with you today. Because in these interviews, I did a Q methodology, or used Q methodology. I want to give you a short introduction on Q methodology, not too much detail, but definitely read the paper if you want some more information. Q methodology is based on a Q set, a Q sort, and then it leads to a factor analysis. The Q set contained in this empirical research 31 statements, all about varying aspects of flood risk communication. Then the respondents performed the Q sort, which is kind of like the sorting of the statements in a Likert scale pyramid, as you can see on the picture of the slide. This method entails that a respondent cannot just scale every statement on its own on a Likert scale, but has to kind of like grade them based on each other as well, because there are only 2 slots on the totally disagree and totally agree, and then it goes up to neutral with 5 slots to place one of the statements. And as the factor analysis led to a kind of like 4 factors, 4 significantly different factors that I have named resident perspectives here. And every one of these perspectives, I have given a specific name that kind of like entails or envisions their perspective on flood risk communication. So I will explain in a bit more detail what these different perspectives consist of. So first, the interceptable confidence. The characteristics of this perspective are that they are aware of flood risk. They say they have quite some knowledge on flood risk. They perceive to be well protected against floods. And they believe that there's already enough flood risk information available. They experience that the government should play a large role in informing them, and they are unwilling to pay for information. And this is related to their perception of the government playing a large role in flood risk communication, because they perceive this information as a common good. In general, you can conclude that this characteristic is quite a passive perspective, as they assume to already have a lot of knowledge. They are not really interested in new forms of communication and do not perceive to be more informed in any way. The second perspective is the self-assured omniscient. The characteristic of this perspective are also that they believe they have a lot of knowledge on flood risk, and therefore kind of like say flood risk communication is not really necessary. They trust that the government has taken the necessary precautions, and therefore there's no need for some expert advice. They really perceive flood risk and flood risk protection as an external factor and something that the government arranges for them. They are, in that sense, willing to use flood risk information websites to get a bit more insight on their own specific flood risk, but they would only visit the websites to confirm what they already know, so they don't expect to learn anything new. I've also asked the respondents about their opinion on these flood probabilities that are often used in communicating, and they conclude that these probabilities do not motivate them to take any adaptation measures at all. Then the third perspective is an acknowledged inexpert. This perspective also assumes to have a lot of knowledge on flood risk, but they do acknowledge that they are not well protected at the moment. And therefore, they are definitely interested in flood risk information and more information on what they can individually do to prevent flood damage. they specifically like the personal aspect of flood risk information. So they wanted it to be tailored to their own own home or own specific flood risk. And they, so they claim that they know quite a bit, but they do acknowledge that it's not enough. And therefore they are willing to adapt to flood risk in the Netherlands. And the fourth and final perspective has the characteristics of that they do acknowledge to need more information. They don't assume to have enough information yet. They don't know enough about flood risk, at least not as much as they would like to. They perceive not to be as well protected as they could be, and they do see a large role for the government to provide them with information, as they do not sufficiently do at the moment. They are interested in both general and personal information, and the flood risk probabilities are, as one of my respondents quotes, true nonsense. And this does give some insight in what these probabilities actually mean to the respondents of the Netherlands regarding flood risk. These probabilities don't really give them the motivation or the urgency to act, whereas this group of insufficiently connected is definitely interested in information on technical measures and benefits, and are willing to adapt their homes to flood risk. So these four perspectives we can align with the cultural theory rationalities. On this slide, you see the four rationalities. One of them is fatalism, which is characterized by perceiving to have no control or influence on the world and risk as a whole, and it's a very passive rationality. Hierarchism attempts to control the world and global changes through rules and regulations, and it has a strong trust in institutions. Individualism stands out because of its perception to have the freedom to make mistakes, as these mistakes also lead to, or this freedom to make mistakes leads to self-determination and individual liberty to make the world a better place. Then the fourth is egalitarianism, and they perceive the world to be a kind of like an unstable balance. There's no room for experiments or mistakes, and if there's not enough attention paid to any risk or hazard, there is a good chance of large-scale disruptions. So what we did in this paper is to analyze the four perspectives of the Q methodology of factor analysis in relation to the four rationalities of cultural theory. And what you see is from these insights that the four different perspectives on flood risk communication do show that these are four distinct rationalities, which have, for residents, they perceive to be they are very different from each other. Even though they kind of overlap to a certain extent, the differences are very obvious in the sense that if flood risk communication strategies are tailored to only the insusceptible confident, then that means that only that rationality or that group of residents of the Netherlands is addressed with that specific flood risk communication strategy. Whereas if a communication strategy tries to cover all these four perspectives, they might not cover any of them at all. As cultural theory says, these four rationalities and therefore worldviews are significantly different, and if you try to address kind of like a one-size-fits-all approach, that means they will seem irrational for all these perspectives and rationalities. So that leads us to the question, should communication strategy one should there be one communication strategy for all of these 4 perceptions, or for just one of these perspectives? Thank you very much.
Okay. So let's see. We're now getting to the next presentation right away. Scott, well, still good in terms of everything. Everything works fine.
Absolutely, everything's great. Really impressed by how well this is working together. This is great.
Okay. So I'm not sure whether you have, when we see the slides, whether you have the presenter also in screen. So I don't know whether it's worth fiddling around with the camera stuff. But next up is Magdalena Rauter. Magdalena Rauter from the University of Life Science. That's not correct. University of Natural Resources and Life Science in Vienna. And if it's all working correctly, the presentation is now set up. And Magdalena, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I will talk about the publication entitled Deconstructing the Legal Framework for Flood Protection in Austria, Individual and State Responsibilities from a Planning Perspective, that was co-authored and authored by me and my colleagues, Arthur Schindlecker, Sven Fuchs, and Thomas Dahler. I'd like to start off with giving you a little bit of a background information on the Austrian context. Due to several factors, we know that people and assets risks are increasing to several types of hazards, and despite that there are various ways of dealing with such hazards like flood events, there still are high flood losses. And on the other hand, there's also development which is ongoing in areas at risk. So we need very appropriate management approaches in order to deal better with those circumstances. And therefore, we need a balanced mix of measures as well as adequate planning measures. In Austria, the situation, when we talk about the legal framework and the organizational structure, is very complex due to a federal system that includes 9 provinces and roughly 2,100 municipalities. And in addition, there's different administrative bodies which are responsible for flood risk management and several tasks within that. So there is a fragmentation of the legal basis as well as the responsibilities, which might lead us to question the effectiveness of flood risk management. And it also makes us question if or in how far individuals and therefore homeowners are expected to take action, and in how far can they actually take action when we look at the regulations. We therefore ask 2 questions. One is whether the Austrian legal framework fosters private flood protection and mitigation for existing buildings, and whether property rights might be impaired by those regulations. In the following talk, we will focus on 3 topics, which might be a little bit or just rolled out from the opposite of a practical approach, because the focus here is on the existing building stock. So we talk about subsequent measures that might be implemented on existing buildings. We then go to the building permission process, and in the end look at preventative planning, which includes zoning and maybe also reclassification of land. Starting off with the responsibilities in flood risk management. Normally, individuals are required to take action when the public protection cannot be met, so that's the personal responsibility. But theoretically, that only restricts or is only possible at the individual level, so at property level or building level. So the responsibility that's actually taken by the homeowner is of course way smaller than the responsibilities that can be taken from the state side. However, we still realize that there's a lack of awareness and also often a low willingness to implement such measures. And therefore, there's a lot of legal regulations. in that system. When we start off with the individual perspectives, we know that as of the laws, property is inviolable, and there are certain very strict regulations, but then also the federal government sets standards for construction in that certain case, which normally is either permission or restriction. But then there's also duties of action as well as duties of omission, which interfere with those property rights. So there might be some restrictions that also then result from conflicting land uses, for example. And when we then look at the planning perspectives, we quickly realize that even though building development in areas at risk should be the exception, that's not really the case. And also, assuming from that statement, there should be few restrictions. There are few restrictions actually in the legal matters, which does not really reflect the reality. From the perspective of the federal government, the legal framework is split up. So there are several material laws which deal with natural hazards management, but there is no subjective right for the protection against natural hazards. And usually the instruments are coercive measures, although one would not really expect that because buildings should not be built in areas at risk. When we now look at the existing building stock, we see that normally there are regulations which aim at very basic definitions that are basically targeted at the suitability of land and whether it's appropriate for building development or not. But as there are so many existing buildings in such areas, we still need regulations that deal with those issues, and therefore there are regulations, but mostly only when we make modifications to buildings. So we quickly came to realize that there's actually not many regulations which would influence a homeowner to take measures. What we also realized is that those regulations vary quite a lot between the provinces in Austria, the 9 provinces. And so I just quickly want to give you 2 examples here, which is normally that either those regard the elevation of buildings, for example, also the elevation of the upper ground floor edge, but then there is certain other regulations depending on the province. For example, in the first example, the buildings are to be sealed against water penetration, for example, or very specifically in Salzburg, where floor levels need to be 15 centimeters above flood levels. So we quite clearly see already the complexity in that framework. When we now come to the building process, there are the story of complexity continues, and what's the same is the suitability of the sites as a requirement for building permission, which is granted by the authority in the process regarding building land. But we also see that, again, there's certain differences in those requirements between provinces. And so sometimes even additional information, for example, can be requested by the authority in order to gain more information on the specific situation. And in certain cases, there are building bans applied as well. When we then come to the zoning of land, again, we want to keep areas that are in any way influenced by natural hazards free of development due to those unfavorable natural conditions. And the 2 differences that we can see here are mainly the quantitative versus the qualitative assessments. So sometimes we talk about areas in 100-year flood zones that are prohibited from building, as in the first case in Lower Austria. and also the very specific case of Upper Austria, where zoning of building land is not permitted in, for example, 30-year or 100-year flood runoff areas. But then sometimes requirements or definitions are not as clear, and basically still reflect back on the unfavorable natural conditions. Should land not be appropriate for building, land can also be reclassified. So in inundation areas, reclassification of building land is apparent in order to, with the main aim, reduce hazard potentials. And one example here would be a very detailed, on the one hand, description, but then on the other hand, still quite open description of how such sites are actually defined. As we can see here, that regards the definition in Carintha, regards all hazard types, so floods, rockfall, avalanches, mudslides, and often they don't really then specifically focus on one type like flooding. Another case would be building bans, which applies again to areas which are not suitable for building, and we can see the definition is also for all types of hazards. So again, some definitions are very basic, and we can find them in most of the provincial planning laws or building laws. But then again, we have those differences, for example, here in Lower and Upper Austria, that regard again the 100 or 30-year flood zones. And that pretty much, I would say, summarizes the very high level of differences in those planning and building regulations in the Austrian system. So the 9 different regulations at provincial level with very different approaches, qualitative versus quantitative, as already mentioned before. Potential conflicts of such regulations that also, of course, interfere with private and property law. And basically, the more at the beginning we are of a building process, the easier it is to interfere. And for existing buildings, it gets harder to actually have a way of dealing with floods and adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll just set up the next presentation. Scott, we're still good in terms of audio and stuff, right?
Yes, we are. Just a reminder to everyone in the audience, I know a lot of people ask that all the recording of the event will be on our YouTube webpage, as well as links to on our webpage, and we'll hopefully have these slides. I don't know if we'll have them all together or if we'll have them all separate, but we'll have them for you to peruse. I know that's frequently asked question, so we're happy to provide that for folks. Thank you.
Okay, so we move on to the next presentation, which is by Sally Priest, a co-authored paper. Sally, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I am presenting today on the paper Sticks and Carrots for Reducing Property Level Risks from Floods, an EU-US comparative perspective. I'm presenting on behalf of the lead author, Kathy Sykins, and also my co-authors, which included legal scholars from the US and also the Netherlands. I'll get right into the presentation because I know hopefully we've got some questions to get to, so I'll try and keep to time. So just a brief overview of what the focus of the presentation is, and it follows nicely on from the previous presentation by Magdalena. We're also focusing on existing property and looking at, from a legal perspective, what are the legal and policy requirements applicable to existing buildings, either after a flood event, but also in redevelopment. So once when existing buildings are being updated and redeveloped, so what is possible? And we'll be providing examples from, or the paper provides examples from the United States, England, and the Netherlands within this comparative analysis. And we adopted 2 approaches to the analysis. Firstly, a real in-depth look at the law, what the legal systems say about reconstruction and about redevelopment, and how that relates to how we can be managing floods better. But also in the broader context of the legal systems, so not only the law in relation to flood risk management, but also thinking about it from a broader perspective and how might we demonstrate that. So what examples of good or bad practices are there, mainly focusing on the good. And you'll see within the paper that there are a number of different examples from each of the countries to highlight some of the good practices. I know this slide looks very complicated and there's a lot of words on it, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about this because of time. But what I wanted to focus on is that we've compared systems where there are some similarities, but there are also some quite large differences. From the English perspective, where the focus is resting on the responsibility of the property owner, through to the Netherlands, where we have a highly institutionalized approach to flood risk management, but also where there is a recognized safety standard or a recognized responsibility of the government to provide flood risk management, which is in contrast to England, where we have very much permissive powers. Overseeing both of those different legal systems, we also have the EU legal approach, and particularly for those of you who may be watching not based in Europe, we have the Floods Directive, which is a piece of overarching legislation, or a directive, which is adopts a risk-based approach. So we're looking to not prevent all flood risks, but also look at different ways of managing flood risks, and adopts the 3 Ps of prevention, protection and preparedness for flooding. So both of those countries sit within the EU legislation. So we have to be mindful of how that interacts with the national situations. And then we have the United States situation, whereby we have federal competencies which are required, but a lot of responsibilities for flood risk management are reliant at the state level, so they're being enacted at the state level. So from that, I wanted to just highlight that we have these similarities, but we also have these differences, and we wanted to see actually in reality how things are the same or different, in order to how can we encourage and motivate or require, if we think about the sticks, property level measures at that kind of scale. So I'm focusing on kind of 3 main areas, and this is a very simplified slide of what is in the paper. But we primarily looked at post-disaster relief measures through insurance and compensation, but also to a certain extent building regulations. So what are the requirements on redevelopment? And 2 of our countries, the US and England, have insurance systems. They are very different insurance systems. So with the National Flood Insurance Program in the United States, providing government-led, government-backed flood insurance to high-risk areas, as long as the local government has placed ordinances in place to both raise awareness of that risk, but also to try to reduce increasing risk in those areas. I'm sure a lot of you watching, if you are from the States, recognise that there are some fundamental problems with the National Flood Insurance Programme, both in terms of its legacy of debt and whether the maps are up to date, etc. And it doesn't account for climate change exceptionally well. So the role in which it places on influencing resilience is at the moment relatively minor. Contrasting to that, in England we have a private market system, but with the introduction of Flood Re in 2016, we now cross-subsidise the insurance for individual properties in high-risk areas from the pool of the general market of the insurance, with the aim to move towards risk reduction measures and risk reflective pricing in 25 years' time. So there's a high potential there to influence change and to influence property level measures through the insurance system. but that's really yet to be realised, and there are a lot of barriers to which that can be achieved. In the Netherlands, you don't have very much insurance provided. There is flood insurance, but it's very low penetration. But we do have the Calamities Compensation Act, which looks to provide some level of relief post-event, but it has a lot of uncertainties and a lot of unknowns. So, for instance, will it be enacted? How much will property owners get? And there's no real tie on risk reduction related to that. So moving on to building regulations. So in all 3 countries, we saw building regulations in relation to floods present. Although particularly in the England and the Netherlands, there's a lot of work that could be undertaken to improve those different measures. In the United States, all states we identified had adopted building codes to make properties more weather and flood resilient. And where those were implemented, they were seen to be very successful, and there's some examples in the paper of where they've been successful. However, they're not mandatory in all states. So the degree to which they are impacting at the moment is not as high as it might be in the future if certain requirements were made mandatory. The final aspect that I'll talk about is the Property Level Flood Resilience Grant Scheme, which is a government funded grant scheme in England. And the aim of this is the opportunity for flood affected properties, property owners, to apply for a £5,000 grant to be spent on making properties more resilient post-flooding. And the aim here is to bridge the gap between a flood insurance claim and resilient reinstatement, which is often requires a greater investment than the insurer is willing or able to pay. This has been becoming much more successful in the English context following floods. And I think is a lesson and a model that might be, with some few tweaks and some lessons from it, adopted in other countries, particularly in other countries that have insurance approaches. Rather than paying out insurance and again, we can take some action to try to improve situations. And moving on to my final slide, I think the key messages from this cross-country analysis is that there is a lot of high potential out there to affect change, and that the legal systems that we have, even though they're quite different, aren't providing barriers to these measures. But the ways in which we are mandating or incentivizing this resilience needs some work and needs to be looked at. We do have some really good examples of best practices, of innovations where these things are working. And I think there's a lot of lessons that we can learn for the transferability of some of these different types of schemes, these different types of measures, to make or take the opportunities that are there to improve flood resilience and resilient reinstatement post-event. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sally. So let me see if I can now switch back to.
Well, thank you to all of our presenters. That was really great. I was quite impressed. Now let me know if you guys have to go. I think we had allocated about an hour for this event, and I think we've used about an hour. So we have a few questions if you have time. Will that work?
Yes, of course. That's the idea. So
excellent.
Fire them up.
Let me cue these up. All right. Again, reminder to everyone in the audience, if you have questions, go ahead and type them into the question box on the right side of your GoToWebinar control panel, and then I'll route them through to the audience. And please, if you have a very specific question for one of our presenters, I may not have time to get to it, so please just follow up directly with one of our presenters if you have a question about a slide or something you might have heard that you want to review. Go ahead and follow up with them directly. Let me find a good question to start out with here. How about this? Jacques Genius from Athens, Greece asks, are there any generic solutions for flood risk management, or can we consider every case to be a special case? So, I mean, are there some best practices and generic options that work, or do we have to really look at this, each one as a tailor-made solution? And within making those tailor-made solutions, you know, can we have some sort of framework which sort of helps us identify the ways they kind of can maybe communicate to most directly? Please, anyone on the panel, respond.
We did discuss it this morning, so it must be a very easy one to answer. So I don't know who wants to give it a first
start out with.
first try. So
shall I start?
Yeah.
Shall I start? I would say the answer to that, and I'm going to sit on the fence, is both. So I think that we can develop some really interesting frameworks from which we can identify the range of different options. But I think ultimately we need to be also thinking about who we are wanting to manage the situation, or who is required to manage that situation. So I think the answer to that question would be, are we looking for an individual response? Are we looking for a governmental or a community or a group response? So I think that we always have to be mindful that perhaps we need some national consistency to the way in which we are looking at responding, whether that's via the process. But ultimately, I would say that, and of course there are situations which are similar in different places, but I would say ultimately we also really need to be looking at the tailored approach. And by tailoring to the approach, I'm not only talking about the measure itself, but also the way in which we communicate with stakeholders and those at risk in that situation, and how we involve people in that as well.
Others want to add on that, or do you have more pending questions right now? Scott?
We have a number of questions. You know, I think maybe we can kind of follow up on that with another question from Rachel Carmichael-Campbell, who asks, how do we tailor communications to individual audiences, and how do we isolate groups? How do we make those choices?
That might be some question for you, Karin.
So what I did in my research is just kind of like a small sample, and I think it's the kind of research that has already been done and is being performed on a larger scale, to kind of like analyze these different perspectives on flood risk communication, therefore preferences. So I do think it's definitely possible, and I don't think it's necessary to tailor flood risk communication to the individual itself, but definitely to the resident's perspective. So one of the main conclusions, based on the comments of the respondents in my research, is that the way flood risk is communicated at the moment is not suiting or fitting their perspectives, and is not fitting their preferences either. I'm not sure if that's
okay. Well, we don't have the feedback whether the question has been properly answered, but Scott, you would tell us if you would get signals from like that from the audience.
Yes, I
don't.
do.
Okay, so Scott, do you think there are two, 3 more pressing questions that we can answer? So let's take 2 or 3 more and then conclude.
You know, I think that one question here coming up is asking, a couple of different people are asking versions of the same question about, you know, who is responsible for issuing standards for buildings? One person's asking here about, in Austria, is it the city, the region, the central government? We have another question that's sort of asking, does Belgium have a government flood issuing program, insurance program? So I think a real question is sort of, you know, from, you know, at a scalar level, you know, where are you seeing some of the best options coming out? You know, are there certain levels at the national level, the local level, that's indispensable? And how can these all work together, maybe to create the best outcomes?
again, a question that we discussed elaborately this morning in the large set conference of the FloodLabel project. But I think that Magdalena, do you want to start off with the question on responsibility, and probably Peter, you want to add then on the insurance? Yeah.
Okay. So for responsibilities, I would say that in general, as I quickly touched upon before, is that so many different authorities are responsible for flood risk management in general. And then in addition to that, there's a lot of legal guidelines or acts and frameworks in general where aspects of natural hazard management and therefore flood risk management are sedimented in. So that makes the situation very complex. But then for the specific question on if we now look at property level, the planning regulation and also the building codes, they are broken down on provincial levels, and that's why we have so many differences there again also between those provinces, and that's why we can't really have that overarching approach, which I guess makes sense in a way as well, that the topography in Austria is so different, and we couldn't really deal with that if it was on the federal level. So it does make sense, I would say, in certain situations, but still keeps that complexity in there as well.
And what were you asking again about Flanders?
It was about the flood insurance. If there is a flood insurance.
Oh, right. So in Flanders there is an insurance program. Actually, everyone that has a fire insurance is also included with for flood damage, any kind of. And as I just heard today, even this insurance is even better than the state recovery fund that sometimes backs up the private insurances, as the private insurance recover the new state of well, damaged TVs or whatever. So there is something, but of course this is not a situation. Yeah, you're not only counting on the recovery, you should also try to prevent or protect.
Okay, Scott, anything more like overarching themes that we should address, or should we conclude? So,
you know, one question, we don't even get these kind of questions very often, so I think it's interesting and worth passing around, is I know we've all kind of addressed these studies from different methodological viewpoints, and someone, Samid Latif, in the National Energy University in Malaysia, Malaysia, has asked what's the best flood risk model working with MATLAB software. But I'd also be curious to hear some of the panelists speak, maybe if they could talk about, you know, the role of methods in doing their research, if they felt that, you know, the interviews were the best process, or if they, you know, found a literature review to be more useful. What different methods were used? How might that impact the research?
I don't know that that's a general question to all of us, but I think what all the contributions have in common really is not maybe a certain methodological focus, but a focus on the homeowner, on the residents. So that was the key focus of it, and we approached it from legal, governance, communication perspectives. I'm not sure whether the question about a model is something that we would be able to tackle at this moment.
I think from my perspective is it will depend upon what we're trying to know and what we're trying to find out. So I don't want to speak to everyone here, but I think most of us are social scientists here, and I think there's a real value in mixing the more quantitative approaches, which we've heard about today, with the more in-depth qualitative approaches. And I think that there is the real value in that, because I think if you do one or the other, you don't get the full picture, particularly when we're talking about very diverse perspectives, which you would get from a focus on property owners and residents. We all know that communities are very heterogeneous in both their makeup and in their perspectives, and I think that even more so when we get to flood risk views, experiences. So I think without having the kind of focus on both the quantitative and the qualitative, but also in-depth analysis of the legal situation or the responsibility situations, you don't get the full picture, which is why the special issue in Water International is a very interesting contribution to this literature, because it has a number of different methodologies and approaches to this topic in it.
And let me add to that. We're now broadcasting from Utrecht University, where we have the final conference on the FloodLabel project, which is a very specific tool. If you want to figure out more about it, check out floodlabel.eu, and you will learn more about the tool and the project we're doing in the joint program initiative of Urban Europe. So that's kind of the approach here at the panel, I would say. So three of the panelists are deeply involved in the project. But allow me also to say that the special issue that has now been mentioned a couple of times was edited also by Willemijn van Doorn-Hoekveld, Marleen van Rijswijk, both for the legal background, and by Theo Spit and myself with a more planning and governance background. So this gives a bit of an indication where we are with that. There are actually 4 more very exciting contributions in that special issue. So I strongly recommend you to read it. And allow me also to finally say that this special issue is also related to a broader European initiative, a European cost action called Land for Flood. If you search it, it's a land, then a for, and flood.eu, where this relation between flood risk management and land is explored. And this particular project digs deep into the issue of how to deal with landowners and homeowners in the urban realm and the built-up environment. I think that's one of the lacking pieces in the literature at the moment. That sounds like a final word, doesn't it? Scott, what's your point on that?
Yeah, that was quite fine work, and thank you for giving some plugs out there to Water International, our flagship journal. Please, if you have access, go ahead and give that a look and enjoy the article. Please cite our scholars, both our impact factor, would appreciate it, and as well with the scholars. So thank you very much. I'd like to personally thank the panel, everyone. Thomas Hartmann from Wageningen University, Peter Davids from Ghent University, Karen Snow from Utrecht University, Magdalena Rutter from the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Vienna, and Sally Priest, Middlesex University. Like I said earlier, I know that the panel and IWRA, we're all on Twitter, so go ahead and look us up and follow along if you are interested. If these presentations have left you wanting to learn more, go ahead and check out our LinkedIn webpage, where we will post some discussion questions so you can continue to talk about these issues. As well, we'll have the recordings of the webinar, as well as the slides posted on our webpage, iwra.org, and our YouTube channel just as soon as possible. It might take a few days, so give us a short period of time, but we'll have them up pretty soon. I hope that everyone in the audience found the insights that we provided with our panel here today during the special event really helpful. And I hope it gave you some material to think about in the coming days, and generate a lot of creativity for your own work and wanting to follow up and how this will impact your research. So I'd like to remind everyone in the audience again that the webinar was brought to you by the International Water Resources Association, an over 40-year-old nonprofit, non-governmental educational organization. We focus on bridging disciplines and geographies and connecting professionals, students, individuals, corporations, and institutions, everyone who's concerned with the sustainable use of the world's water resources. So if you're interested in knowing more about the association, or perhaps becoming a member, which we would love, please go to www.iwra.org. So on behalf of the whole IWRA office and everybody there at Utrecht University, thank you for tuning in and watching the webinar. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
you.
Okay.